بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين نحمده ونصلي ونسلم على رسوله الكريم أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Welcome to the next lesson of our usul, this semester of usul, this module of usul. We've gone through quite a lot so far, and today we're going to finish off our discussion in terms of degrees of clarity and obscurity. So the principles related to how clear or how obscure a certain text is. So in the previous lesson we looked at clarity. How clear can a ruling be? So we looked at how a ruling can be apparent, and then how it might be a bit more apparent, explicit, where the text is been brought for the purpose of explaining exactly the ruling that you're trying to derive. And then we saw how then the ruling can be even more clear. It can become unequivocal when there is now no possibility of any alternative meanings, any interpretations, or any specification within that text. That makes it unequivocal. That's the third level of clarity. And then finally, the pinnacle of clarity is when it becomes immutable, where it can no longer be abrogated. Naskh is no longer allowed, abrogated. It is now muhkam. So we had those four levels. Today we're going to be moving on to levels of obscurity. So these are another four levels. They kind of match the four levels of clarity. So just as clear as just the same way we had four levels of clarity, we now have four levels of obscurity. And the first level of clarity will match the first level of obscurity, and then and the second will match the second, and they kind of opposite to each other. So just as clear as that, as for example, let's take the third one, unequivocal. Then just as clear as unequivocal was, just the level of clarity achieved by having a source that was unequivocal, when we look at its opposite in the obscurity scale, in the levels of obscurity, then the third level of obscurity, which as it happens to be is called equivocal, the third level of obscurity is just as obscure as unequivocal was clear. That was kind of a long-winded way of saying a very simple point, but yeah, it is what it is. So yeah, as I said, there are four levels, and inshallah we'll be going through those four levels with examples, and we'll finish off with a basic summary of this whole topic, that this whole category of obscurity and clarity. We'll finish off by rounding it. We'll round off that discussion and complete the third category of principles today, inshallah. Okay, so let's get into the lesson then. So if you recall the previous discussion, so we had linguistic designation as our first category of rulings, of principles within the discussion of Kitabullah. And then we looked at usage. So usage, looking at sentences in terms of how the words themselves are used, that was the second category. And now we're looking at clarity and obscurity. So when you have a certain point that you're trying to derive from a text, how clear or obscure is that point from the text that you're trying to get that point from? And so we first looked at the degrees of clarity. And so we had the first level, which was apparent, zahir. So if it's zahir, it's apparent, the apparent understanding. Then we had explicit, slightly more clear than apparent. And then we had unequivocal, where now there is no possibility of misinterpretation or specification within that. So now it's even more clear. It's now more definite, more defined, and more certain proof, even though all of these proofs are certain, definite proofs, as we explained in the last lesson. And then the final one was immutable or muhkam. So if it's muhkam, that means that now that ruling is set in stone, or set in, whatever unchangeable object you want to set it in, and it will never change regardless, right? The Sharia has been defined and it's done, and now this ruling is now muhkam, set in stone. And we gave examples of this category and all the other categories. So we're going to move on now to the first category of obscurity. So we have levels of obscurity as well, and it goes and it increases, there's four levels, and each level gets increasingly obscure. So the first level is the least obscure, slightly obscure, and then it gets to maximum obscurity. So the first level is unclear, what we call unclear or khafi. So if it's khafi, it's slightly unclear. So let's explain khafi. So something which is unclear, a text which is unclear in regards to a ruling, this is when the text itself is understandable, right? You understand the text itself is apparent, but the ruling that you're trying to associate this text to, there's a bit of obscurity in whether this text applies to this ruling or not. So this situation that we're trying to find a ruling for, does this evidence that we've found, does it apply to this context that we're trying to apply it to? There's some kind of obscurity there. There's some kind of ambiguity. There's some kind of lack of clarity, where there's a bit of confusion as to whether we can apply that text to this ruling or not. Now, as I said, this this obscurity isn't because the text itself is obscure. No, the text itself is clear. It's just about its applicability. So for this level, we're just wondering about whether you can apply this text to this scenario or not. And that's where the obscurity lies. So let me give you an example. If I said, go and get me an ice cream, right? Going back to this ice cream, we're really using this ice cream example to its fullest extent. You guys are going to be tired of ice cream and sick of all kinds of desserts by the time I finish with this. Finish teaching you guys. So I tell you, go and get me an ice cream. Now that's a clear statement. You clearly understand what's meant by that. However, can you get a fried ice cream? Does that apply? So if I said go and get me an ice cream, that's my statement. Now does my statement apply to fried ice cream or not? Does fried ice cream if you getting a fried ice cream, is that a valid ruling? Is that a valid outcome for my request? Right? So that's the question. And what about if you got a frozen yogurt? So let's say, I told you go and get me an ice cream. The normal dessert shop was closed, so you went to some other fancy place, and they were selling fried ice cream. If you've not had fried ice cream, then go and try it. It's actually quite nice. It's like ice cream, and they wrap it in a pastry and fry it. So the inside of it is still frozen ice cream, but the outside of it is like a hot pastry. It's quite interesting. Anyway, I've had it once. So is that an ice cream or not? This fried ice cream, is that ice cream or not? Does it come under the same ruling? There's a bit of it's a bit unclear whether this ruling would apply to fried ice cream or not. And likewise, frozen yogurt, it looks like ice cream, seems like ice cream, but is it ice cream? Does the ruling apply or not? So I'll give you a few seconds. What do you guys think? If I told you to go and get a fried ice cream, if I told you to go and get me ice cream and you brought back fried ice cream, or you brought back frozen yogurt, do you think you've abided by the ruling, or do you think you've incorrectly applied the ruling? Would I be happy with either of those two options, right? From a usul perspective, not from my own preference. So park that example for now. Let's go back to unclear, what we mean by unclear. So a text which is unclear, what's the ruling of unclear text? What do you do when a text is unclear? How do you deal with that situation? So what the usul books say is that with a bit of pondering and with a bit of thinking and thought and a bit of, analysis and a bit of brain power, you can figure out whether you can kind of break down this obscurity and figure out the ruling. So it's necessary for a mujtahid in this case, where there's a slight bit of obscurity, that obscurity can be cleared by a little bit of pondering. And what do we mean by this pondering? So you compare the two situations and you look at the statement from the Quran and you look at the context that you're trying to apply it to. Is the obscurity because the context, the meaning of what you're trying to apply it to, the context, is the obscurity because the context is slightly deficient in meaning to the meaning of the sentence, or does the context have some slight excess in meaning to the meaning of the context? So does the context have some additional meaning which makes it slightly obscure whether this ruling applies to that context or not, because there's some slight additional meaning here? Or is it because the context is missing some of the meaning of this sentence, right? And again, this is very abstract, so let's apply it to our example to make it a bit more clear. So I told you to go and get an ice cream, and you've now got the choice. So you're wondering whether me telling you to go and get ice cream applies to frozen yogurts or fried ice cream. So let's compare. Ice cream. What's an ice cream? So an ice cream is, a dairy. It's usually made up of dairy, contains a certain amount of dairy within it, a lot of sugar, and it's usually like soft and creamy. It's not compared to like a popsicle, etc. So we've got some kind of understanding of what an ice cream is. Now, what's a fried ice cream? A fried ice cream is ice cream. It has ice cream in it, but you wrap pastry around it and fried it. Now, has that changed the ice cream in any way? No. The ice cream in there is still ice cream. If you've had a fried ice cream, it's a normal ice cream, right? Inside, and the outside, the outside is a pastry. So what you've done is there's some additional meaning within fried ice cream, right? But the actual meaning of ice cream is still in there, right? Because the ice cream still exists inside, but there's just this additional meaning, which is this pastry layer on the outside. So you've got this additional element to this dessert, which isn't in the original statement that I requested. So that's that scenario. Now, what about the frozen yogurt scenario? A frozen yogurt is made up of, yogurt. It's like it's got those cultures and stuff. It uses a different type of ingredient from the beginning, right? And I think, if I remember correctly from a quick Google search, ice cream, in order to label something ice cream, I think in the US they say that, is it the FDA, the Food Standards Association? That's the UK, whatever the US equivalent is. Food Standards Association is UK. Whatever the US equivalent is, FDA, the Food and Drug Authority. I'm not sure. Whatever it is. Food and Diet Authority? I knew it when I looked at it. Anyway, they have this requirement that in order for an ice cream to be labeled ice cream, it has to have, I think, 10% milk fat within it. So 10% of the content of the ice cream has to be milk fat. So basically, where am I going with all of this? A frozen yogurt can't be marketed as ice cream, right? And I know I'm going quite deep into this example. It's just a hypothetical example I made up. But a frozen yogurt is therefore deficient in meaning compared to ice cream, because if you're choosing the definition of ice cream according to what the FDA has regulated ice cream to be, right? Just for the sake of this example, then a frozen yogurt is slightly deficient in meaning to an ice cream. It looks like an ice cream. It has texture similar to an ice cream. However, it's fundamentally deficient in meaning compared to to an ice cream, because I think a frozen yogurt usually has 3 to 4% milk fat compared to, the minimum 10% requirement, or 5% maybe, from what I remember in my head, from what I remember when I searched it up. Anyway, so a frozen yogurt is an example where the meaning is slightly deficient. So what do we do with this? So the ruling says that then you have this statement and this scenario that you're trying to apply it to, and there's some obscurity there because you're not sure if the meaning in the statement, so the statement is quite clear, it's apparent, but its applicability to the scenario, there's a bit of obscurity there. So the ruling was that you have to ponder whether the scenario you're trying to apply it to, if the meaning of the sentence applies to that scenario or not. And usually the scenario will either be, the obscurity will be because of some kind of deficiency in meaning when you compare the scenario to the ruling, or because of some kind of addition in meaning, some kind of excess meaning, some kind of additional meaning in the scenario, which makes it a bit unclear whether the ruling applies or not. So we've done this pondering now. We've realized that with fried ice cream, there's a slight addition in meaning because there's this additional pastry, right? Which makes it a bit confusing as to whether this is an ice cream or not, right? But at the basis of it, it is an ice cream, but it just has this additional meaning of pastry on top, this fried element. So that's like an additional meaning. If you look at the definition of ice cream, it's present here, but there's this additional meaning where a fried ice cream would have to have this additional fried element. And then if you look at this frozen yogurt, when you ponder whether that applies or not, you'd say, okay, yeah, they both look the same and sound the same, and they both look the same, and in texture they're similar, but at the heart of it, this milk fat condition isn't there. So there's a slight deficiency in meaning when you compare ice cream to frozen yogurt. So therefore, we could say that the ruling, when I said go and get me ice cream, it would apply to the fried ice cream, but it wouldn't apply to the frozen yogurt. So when the scenario is slightly deficient compared to the meaning, you can't apply the rule, because the rule applies to that specific definition. When that definition is deficient here, then the rule can't apply. But when the meaning is not deficient, when there's a slight excess meaning, well, then the meaning's still there, but there's a bit of an excess, right? So the ruling can apply to when there's a slight addition in meaning. Now, this is how the usul books have explained it. And so that's why it's a bit, long-winded, this explanation. So I do apologize for that, and I hope I've made it make sense for you guys with the ice cream and the thingy. And I hope I haven't confused any of you guys with this extra explanation. Let's look at an example from the Quran. Let's actually get to the meat of what this applies to. So the Quran mentions وَالسَّارِقُ وَالسَّارِقَةُ فَقْطَعُوا أَيْدِيَهُمَا, that the thief, the male and female thief, the person who steals something, the male and female who steals, then فَقْطَعُوا أَيْدِيَهُمَا, the Quran says cut their hands, right? This is mentioned in the Quran. Now, the books of usul mention this example as an example of obscurity. Now, the ruling is pretty clear. If you're a thief, then the Quran is telling you this is the ruling, right? Obviously, this applies to when the Muslims are actually in charge, etc., right? What do you call it? This is just what the Quran says. That's what I'm saying. I'm not advocating anybody to go and actually carry out this ruling. This is a ruling for the ruler, not a ruling for like a khilafa, when there's a Muslim khalif, not to just me and you living in a Western country. We don't apply this. Anyway, so the Quran says this. Now, the usul books have mentioned that can we apply this ruling to scenarios which are similar to stealing, but there's a slight obscurity in whether they come under the meaning of stealing or not. So the scenarios they mention is a pickpocket. So somebody who comes in, brushes past you, and cuts your money belt from your belt and runs off with it, or sticks his hand into your your purse, and steals some money and runs off. That's it's what's called a is it a tarrar, from what I recall. I have to open the book and check, but if I recall correctly, it's a tarrar. So effectively a pickpocket. And the other example that they compare it to is a grave robber. A grave robber, a um, a shroud robber, somebody who digs up graves and steals the shroud. What's called a nabash. So, are these counted as thieves? People who do this, are they counted as thieves? And does the ruling which the Quran has mentioned for a thief apply to these people or not? So the usul books mention that. So let's establish something. This ruling is pretty clear in regards to a thief, right? It's zahir. In fact, it's nas, right? It's explicit. In regards to a thief, the ruling is pretty clear. However, it's khafi. It's unclear in regards to whether it applies to a pickpocket and a grave robber. So what was the ruling? We have to do some ta'ammul. We have to do some pondering. We have to think about this scenario a bit to see if the definition fits in these two scenarios or not. So, is the obscurity due to the context being deficient, or due to the context having a bit of excess? So, is the grave robber and the pickpocket, is the obscurity in regards to them due to the grave robber or the pickpocket having some kind of excess meaning in addition to what comes under the meaning of theft, or due to some kind of deficiency in their meaning from the meaning of theft? That's what we need to figure out. So, what does it mean? What does theft mean in Islam? What does theft mean according to Sharia? The jurists say that theft, the ruling of theft, applies to something that is stolen which was guarded. So you have to steal something that was guarded or under protection, right? If you steal something that's out in the open and is not under any protection, like, there was a tree, public tree, and you stole some fruits from that public tree, then that doesn't come under the meaning of theft. It might still be wrong. There would be another ruling associated to that. They might get punished in some other way. But the ruling of theft doesn't apply unless that thing is guarded, right? So unless somebody goes into your house quietly at night while you're sleeping, right? Obviously your house is guarded because you're there, right? But so the meaning of theft comes here. Now, what about, and the second meaning of theft is that it has to be undercover. It has to be quiet, surreptitious. So it has to be stolen surreptitiously. So a robbery is different. A robbery where somebody, pulls a knife out, or, pulls out a gun, or, uses some kind of force or intimidation. That's not what Sharia counts as sariqah, theft. That's counted as another ruling. That would come under a different ruling. Now, that would probably come under highway robbery or something. Robbery. The ruling of robbery is different to the ruling of theft. So there's two meanings under theft that we have to look at. The first is whether it was done surreptitiously, and the second is whether it was stolen from a place which was protected, whether the object that was stolen was protected, and it has to be above a certain value, etc. So does it apply to a pickpocket? Now, a pickpocket has stolen something, has stolen money from someone, from their purse, which was maybe tied around their belt. Now, the money was inside a purse and the person was guarding that purse, right? He had it on his person. It was protected. So the meaning of protection is there. Likewise, a pickpocket usually steals surreptitiously. He steals quietly. He doesn't do it brazenly, openly, right? It might sometimes be brazen, but it's still quiet in that the person who is being stolen from doesn't know that he is being stolen from. So you could argue that the meaning of sariqah, theft, does apply to a pickpocket. Now there is an additional meaning. A pickpocket usually does so quickly. It's usually a very quick process, right? Bisur'atin, that's what the usul books have mentioned. And while the person is awake, so it's a bit brazen. There's that additional meaning there, right? Where the person is awake and guarding the thing, but it's still done surreptitiously and from an enclosed and protected space. And so therefore, despite this excess in meaning of the pickpocket stealing, whilst the person is awake, and stealing whilst stealing in a quick way, right, with this additional meaning of speed and hastiness, we would say that the ruling of theft in the Quran would apply, or the usulis would say that the ruling of theft in the Quran would apply to a pickpocket. Now, what about a grave robber? Does the ruling of theft apply to a grave robber according to the usulis? So they would say that a grave robber is stealing undercover and quietly. Wait, is he? Because, okay, let's say a grave. So number one, is a grave a fortified, protected place? Right? Who's protecting it? The dead person is dead. He can't protect anything, right? So that's one way in which it's the meaning of theft isn't found. The other thing is, he's not really stealing it quietly, because the occupant of the grave can't defend himself. The occupant of the grave is not a deterrent. So the grave robber can steal quite openly, can dig up the grave quite openly. It's not quiet at all. The occupant of the grave that he's stealing from is well aware of it, in the sense that he's present when it happens, etc. But he's unable to defend his possession of his kafan, his shroud. So therefore, this is an example of the meaning being deficient. So a grave robber, the ruling of theft, of sariqah, of theft, of stealing, would not apply to a grave robber. Like I said, there will be another rule for a grave robber that the scholars of fiqh come up with and they will write about. And likewise, the usulis. However, this verse and this ruling in regards to stealing won't necessarily apply to a grave robber. So we'll leave that one there and we'll go on to the other levels of obscurity in the next part of the lesson, inshallah. Okay, so we've covered the first level of obscurity. If I just remind you, the first level of obscurity was khafi, which is unclear. Now we move on to the next level, which is mushkil. Mushkil means difficult, but I've translated it here as obscure, right? Now the literal meaning is difficult, i.e. it's difficult to get a meaning from it. But in English, while Arabic it has that nuance of unclear, in English the word difficult doesn't really mean unclear. So I was hesitant to use the word difficult in English as a translation, even though it is probably the closest translation. So I've gone with a more loose translation of obscure, a more meaningful translation, though it's less doesn't apply as well. Anyway, like I said, translation is difficult to be intuitive. So often, especially when I was studying it, I just preferred to using the Arabic phrases khafi and mushkil. But obviously this is an English class, so I do have to give you a translation. So we'll go with obscure. Now, if you recall, initially I had labeled sarih as obscure, sorry, elusive, kinaya as, oh no, I didn't. I said enigmatic. Okay, that's fine then. But like I said, this chart is what we're going to be going with for the sake of this course, inshallah. So, what is obscure? What is a word which is mushkil, or a sentence which is mushkil? Now, this is a higher level of obscurity than the first level, which was unclear. So, that, remember, the first level was the applicability of this text to this scenario is slightly obscure, though the text itself is clear. Now, the text itself is a bit unclear. The text itself has multiple meanings. The text itself has multiple possibilities. So we don't know which possibility to use. This is a higher level of obscurity. Now the text itself is not clear. Before, the text was clear, but the applicability was the cause of obscurity. Here, the text itself is obscure. So here the ruling is that there are two stages for this kind of to figure out a ruling. There are two stages. Before, remember, there was one stage. Before, I said you have to ponder and you have to try and use a bit of brain power to try and figure out whether it's applicable or not. Here, there's two stages. First of all, you have to go and figure out what are all the possible meanings, what are all the possible interpretations of this obscure text. Then you ponder and figure out which one of those meanings fits the best. So I'm going to go back to my standard example for whenever we have a text of multiple meanings. And homonyms are a great example of obscure texts. So go and get me a bat, please. Right? That is obscure because you don't know which meaning of bat I am intending. So what you have to do is you have to apply the two-part ruling. The first part is you have to go and figure out what are all the meanings, all the possible meanings of this homonym. What are all the possible meanings of this obscure text? So the word bat is obscure. What are all the possible interpretations? And as we've covered before, the possible meanings are a winged mammal or a certain instrument used in sports to hit a ball, usually. An object that you use in sports to hit a ball, that is a bat. So now that you've identified the possible interpretations, you need to ponder and see which one fits the best. So you think about it and you think, yeah, I don't know what he's going to do with the winged mammal. Why would he want a winged mammal? It's not necessarily like you can eat it. It's not halal to eat. Well, I'm not sure if it's halal to eat. I don't think it's halal to eat. So what's he going to do with it? He must want... He's more likely that he's going to play a sport which involves a bat. And so he wants me to buy the bat that's used in sport. That's an easy example. Now, the example that's given in Mabadi al-Usul is a bit more unintuitive. And you guys are probably sick of unintuitive examples. Well, it's not unintuitive. It's just a very specific example which doesn't really apply in English very well. We don't really use this word, right? So the example given in the book is, so we'll go over it and we'll explain it, but just bear that in mind. The example given is man halafa alla ya'tadim, that he swears an oath that he's not going to have idam. He's not going to eat idam. What is idam? Idam is something that's enjoyed with bread. That's an idam. So generally, if you think about the Arabs back in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, they probably ate very simple meals. So they would have bread, and then they'd have something with the bread to make the bread easier to eat, or something that went well with bread. So for example, some fat, right, some oil or something, they dip the bread in and it would just make the bread a bit more palatable, because you can't just eat raw bread, right? Maybe a modern example is, we have our butter with our bread and butter, or jam. In the hadith mentions ni'mal idamu al khal, the best idam is vinegar, i.e. the hadith is recommending that you eat your bread with vinegar. And it was said that the Prophet ﷺ used to like eating vinegar with his bread. That's why he said this. He went, I think the full hadith is, he went to the house of a Sahabi and they had bread and they didn't have anything else except vinegar. And so the Prophet ﷺ was like, perfect. The best condiment to bread is vinegar. The best idam is vinegar. So anyway, this is just, I'm just giving you an idea of how the word is used in Arabic. So somebody swears that he's not going to have idam. That means that if he has idam, his oath will break and he'll have to pay an expiation. So can he eat meat? Or can he eat eggs with his bread? Or can he have cheese? Right? All of these, there's a question. So we need to apply our two-part ruling. First, you go and figure out what idam is and what it consists of. And then you go and you verify, does the definition fit our scenario? Now, that example is there, right? And I'm not going to go and delve more into this because I don't see the need. But because the example was mentioned in Mabadi al-Usul, I felt it necessary to go over that example here, right? So if any of you happen to go through the book and you see this example, you at least know what it's talking about. But I'm not going to go detailed and actually pursue this example further. We're not going to go and figure out what idam actually is and see whether all these things go for it or not, because I don't see the need. I found a better example. So Masar al-Usul, if you remember, that was my secondary book, the book that I'm using as a reference. That had a very nice example. In the Quran it says, فَأْتُوا حَرْثَكُمْ أَنَّا شِئْتُمْ. So the full verse is نِسَاؤُكُمْ حَرْثٌ لَكُمْ فَأْتُوا حَرْثَكُمْ أَنَّا شِئْتُمْ. That women, i.e. your wives, are your place of cultivation, talking to the men, that women are your place of cultivation of your seed. So, فَأْتُوا حَرْثَكُمْ أَنَّا شِئْتُمْ. Approach your place of cultivation. أَنَّا شِئْتُمْ. What does أَنَّا شِئْتُمْ mean? So, شِئْتُمْ means you wish, right? And أَنَّا has two meanings. It can either mean where or how. So, with both of these, the verse would mean women are your place of cultivation. And so then the next part would be, approach your place of cultivation either wherever you wish or however you wish. Anna is a word which has multiple meanings. So it's mushkil. It is difficult or it is obscure. So we have to apply our two-part ruling. The first is figure out all the possible meanings. So when you figure out the possible meanings, you realize that anna can either mean where or how. Now you do ta'ammul. Now you ponder which of those meanings fits best. So let's do the first step. What are the possible meanings of anna? Now I've already said where and how, but we can actually look at it in more detail. So what are the possible meanings of anna? Anna can mean where, and in the Quran it comes in that meaning. Zakaria alayhi salam says to Maryam alayhi salam, anna laki hadha. When he sees all these fruits and from various out of season fruits in her chamber, Zakaria alayhi salam goes to Maryam alayhi salam, where did you get all of these? Where did you get this? Anna, where did you get this? Where did this come from for you? Right? So where? That's one meaning of anna. The other meaning of anna is how. And this also comes in the Quran. And again is Zakaria alayhi salam. أَنَّا يَكُونُ لِي غُلَامٌ قَالَ رَبِّ أَنَّا يَكُونُ لِي غُلَامٌ وَكَانَتِ امْرَأَتِي عَاقِرًا وَقَدْ بَلَغْتُ مِنَ الْكِبَرِ عِتِيًّا. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells him that I am going to give you a child. And so Zakaria alayhi salam goes, أَنَّا يَكُونُ لِي غُلَامٌ. How can I get a child when my wife is barren and, etc. So anna here comes in the meaning of how. How can I get a child? So in the Quran, this word comes in two different ways, two different meanings. So in this verse, it's unclear which of these two meanings applies to this scenario. So we've done the first step. We've figured out the possible meanings for this difficult word, for this obscure word, anna. Now we have to do our pondering. Which of these best fits? So let's look at, first of all, where. If we take the meaning of where, then it is approach your place of cultivation wherever you wish. Now this is problematic. Taking this meaning is problematic because we know that it's impermissible to approach in from certain directions. So approaching from the rear is not allowed, right? I'm using elusive language here. You can figure out the cues. I'm doing a kinaya, elusive language here, right? I'm being deliberately elusive. So, you can fill in the blanks because I don't want to be lewd. So yeah, approaching from the rear, approaching your place of cultivation. Remember, place of cultivation was your women, your wife. So approaching from the rear is impermissible. So if you say the verse means approach your place of cultivation wherever you wish, that entails permissibility of approaching from the rear as well. So this is a problematic interpretation. What about the other interpretation? However you wish. Approach however you wish. Well, that means, then, if you say approach your place of cultivation however you wish, then you're saying that entails permissibility of approaching in whichever position you wish. It's more of that meaning. So for example, sitting, lying down, all of these various different positions are taking this meaning would entail permissibility of all of these. Now that's obviously not problematic with any other text. So it would seem like the second meaning is makes a lot more sense. So we'll go with the second meaning, the anna in the meaning of how. Approach your place of cultivation however you wish. So just to summarize, we had this verse which had this this difficult word, mushkil. It's difficult. Problematic could be a good translation as well. But anyway, obscure. So this was a word which was a bit obscure. So what we had to do, and the obscurity was because of the word itself. So what did we have to do? We had to ponder. We had to go and first seek out all the possible meanings. So one was how and one was where. Then you ponder. And when you ponder over it, the where meaning is a bit problematic. The where meaning is a bit contradictory. It goes against stuff we know. It entails permissibility of things we know are impermissible. So therefore, we'll take the meaning of how, which makes much more sense. And there's obviously other reasons as well why we take how, but this is just giving an example of mushkil, right? The scholars actually have multiple evidences for why they take how, and not just this, right? But this reason here is just given to illustrate the concept and the principle of mushkil and obscure words. So that was the second category, the second level of obscurity. And we'll do the final two, inshallah, and summarize in the final part of the lesson. Okay, so the final part of the lesson. So just to recap, we've looked at the first two levels of obscurity. If I just show you my diagram, we had khafi, which means unclear. That was the first one. You can see in that light red. And that was where the word itself was clear in terms of what it meant, but its applicability to the scenario at hand, there was a bit of obscurity there. There was a lack of clarity there. And so the ruling was that you have to ponder and you have to try and think a bit to see if you can apply the ruling to this scenario or not, and whether there's an increase in meaning or a deficiency in meaning, and then you can find your ruling. And then the second level was obscure, mushkil, which is where the word itself now is a bit problematic, a bit difficult, a bit obscure, and so you now have a two-part ruling. The ruling now is that you first have to seek out all the possible meanings of this obscure word, and then you ponder and see which one applies the best. And we gave a number of examples for both of those. Now we move on to the third level. The third level, equivocal or mujmal. It is mujmal, it is equivocal. There are multiple possibilities and you can't figure out which one is the correct possibility without further clarification. It's equivocal. This is again a very intuitive translation I like this translation, equivocal, right? And as you can see, it's opposite to mufassar, which is unequivocal. That was where clarification, remember mufassar from the previous lesson, unequivocal. This is where now you've got clarification. The ruling is not going to accept additional specification or additional interpretation. You've now got the clarification from the source itself. It is now unequivocal. This is the exact polar opposite of that. This is where the ruling has so many different possibilities. It is equivocal. There are various different possibilities and we have no way of knowing which one it is unless we get further clarification, right? So you can see, just moving ahead, just, getting a bit ahead of myself, but you can see that once you get that clarification, something equivocal will become unequivocal because you've got clarification, right? So this is how these two categories are opposite. Equivocal is, you can see over there, that way, sorry. Equivocal is the opposite of unequivocal. So let's delve a bit more into that with a few examples. Now, example, let's go back to desserts. I told you, go and get me that dessert that I like. And I didn't tell you anything else. And you weren't sure which dessert it was, right? You knew which shop maybe it was from, but that shop sells 20 different types of desserts. And there's loads of possibilities. You're not allowed to choose for me because I told you specifically, get me a specific one that I like, but you don't know which one that is. So this is equivocal. This is very, very obscure. You don't know which of the possibilities I am referring to. And it's impossible for you to figure that out unless you get further clarification. So the ruling of this is you're not allowed to use this source as evidence. You're not allowed to buy me any dessert until you get that further clarification. Fairly simple. This is mujmal, equivocal. The example given in the Quran, the example given in the usul books from the Quran is another example that we've done many times before. Keeps coming up. وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَى. If you remember, the verse was وَأَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَى. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has permitted trade and He's prohibited riba. So you're probably thinking, okay, but this seems pretty clear. Permitted trade, prohibited riba. Okay, but so where's the obscurity here? And forget obscurity, it's equivocal. There's no way of knowing without further clarification. So you might recall a few lessons ago I mentioned that the Quran never defines what riba is. The Quran just says riba is impermissible. And riba literally just means increase. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has permitted trade, but He's prohibited increase. What does this mean, increase? Prohibited increase. Many trades have increase. What does that mean? Are you not allowed to profit? Profit is a type of increase. So it's impossible to know from the Quran. So you're not allowed to make a ruling on this until you get further clarification. And where do we get this further clarification from? The hadith. the hadith clearly defines what riba is, right? So you know the famous hadith, الذهب بالذهب والفضة بالفضة والملح بالملح والشعير بالشعير, that one. So gold with gold, silver with silver, or gold in exchange for gold, silver in exchange for silver, barley in exchange for barley, salt in exchange for salt, wheat in exchange for wheat, and there's one that I missed, dates in exchange for dates. All of those must be مثلا بمثلا سواء بسواء. um, I can't remember the rest of the hadith, but you know, it must be like for like, equivalent to equivalent for equivalent, equal for equal. I can't remember the rest of the hadith, but that is basically defining what riba is. That it must be equal. You're not allowed to have addition on one side. That's what. So the hadith very clearly clarifies what riba is. So the verse mentioned that increase is not allowed. Now this is a very ambiguous statement. It's equivocal. There's many different possibilities, and there's no way for us to choose one of those possibilities, because there's no way for us to give preference to any one of those possible choices, right? But we have clarification. So we're not allowed to use this verse for any ruling unless we have clarification. And luckily we have that clarification, and it's found in the hadith. And this hadith clarifies exactly what riba is. And there's many hadith that clarify riba. That one is one. And then there's كل قرض جر نفعا فهو ربا. Every loan in which there's benefit favored for one side. That's how you kind of understand that. That's riba. You'll learn this in your furuq fiqh lesson, in your when you learn about Islamic trades, which inshallah hopefully you guys do learn at some point. That's not the topic of usul here, right? Like I said, we're focusing specifically on the principles and not the fiqh itself. Anyway, so that was equivocal. Now, this riba example, now that we've got an understanding, now that we've got clarification from the hadith, it becomes clarified, it becomes mufassar, right? If I just show you this diagram again, we had equivocal, mujmal. It becomes unequivocal. Now, there is no possibility of any other interpretation. The hadith has given you very clearly what the interpretation is, and now we can't choose anything else. It's very clearly defined. So, that was mujmal, equivocal. Our final category, actually I'll bring this back again, shouldn't have changed it. Our final category is mutashabih, incomprehensible. It's impossible to know the meaning. It's impossible to know the meaning of this ever, right? Forget even trying, right? It's not allowed to try to find the meaning of these things. It is incomprehensible. Mutashabih. Mutashabih means similar or confusing, or it has those kind of meanings, right? I prefer incomprehensible. I feel like that's the most nuanced translation for what we're trying to achieve in usul, right? Now, the discussion of mutashabih comes up a lot in aqidah, right? And in fact, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about mutashabih in the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, هو الذي أنزل عليك الكتاب منه آيات محكمات هن الكتاب وأخر متشابهات. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that Allah is the one who sent down the book to you. So Allah sent down the Quran to you, or upon you, O Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Among the verses of that book are verses which are muhkamat, which are immutable. We define muhkam as immutable. It's possible that muhkam here can mean like in a more of a linguistic sense, it can just mean, precise. But some of those verses are immutable, and some of those, and they are the majority of the book. They are the foundation of the book, Kitab. And other verses, وَأُخَرُ مُتَشَابِهَاتٍ. Other verses are mutashabih. Other verses are ambiguous. They are incomprehensible. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about these verses. Those people whose hearts have deviation in them. فَأَمَّا الَّذِينَ فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ زَيْغٌ فَيَتَّبِعُونَ مَا تَشَابَهَ مِنْهُ ابْتِغَاءَ الْفِتْنَةِ. They pursue those verses which are incomprehensible to try and seek fitna, to try and seek corruption. So those people whose hearts are deviated, those people who have deviation in their hearts, they will follow those verses which are mutashabih, those verses which are incomprehensible, trying to seek a way of causing corruption and mischief thereby, وَابْتِغَاءَ تَأْوِيلِهِ, and to try and seek an interpretation from those incomprehensible verses, right? So the Quran said that those who try and seek an interpretation are trying to cause mischief from these verses. There are people who have corruption in their hearts, who have who have deviation in their hearts. They will try and interpret these verses to cause mischief. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا يَعْلَمُ تَأْوِيلَهُ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. None knows its true interpretation except Allah, right? Allah's clearly said it. These verses, their interpretation cannot be known. وَالرَّاسِخُونَ فِي الْعِلْمِ يَقُولُونَ آمَنَّا بِهِ. And even those who are firm in knowledge, they will say, we believe in them. So notice that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows his true interpretation, and even those who are firm in knowledge say in regards to these verses, we believe in them. They don't try and seek an interpretation. Those people who have tried to seek an interpretation, Allah describes them as trying to cause mischief, and those are the people who have deviation in their hearts. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala summarizes and he says, all of these verses are from our Lord. So the rasikhuna fil ilm, those who are firm in knowledge, they will say, we believe in it, all of it is from Allah. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala summarizes and he says, وَمَا يَذَّكَّرُ إِلَّا أُولُو الْأَلْبَابِ, and that only those who are intelligent and have understanding will realize this and will remember this warning. So what do we learn from this verse? This verse, we learn that there are verses in the Quran which are ambiguous and incomprehensible, and only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows the meaning of these verses, and it's impossible for a human mind to comprehend what these verses mean. So what's the ruling in regards to these kind of verses? Well, we already heard from the Quran, but the usul books say, and very similar, and this is obviously where they get it from, that you must believe that these verses are true and they have a meaning which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows. However, we must, and it is necessary to abstain from trying to figure out what that meaning is. You have to leave it to Allah. So once again, it is necessary to believe in these verses being true and having a meaning which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows, but abstaining from trying to figure it out and leaving the meaning of that to Allah. So the verses are true, whatever they mean, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So what are examples of such incomprehensible verses? Well, obvious example is the huruf muqatta'at, the huruf, at the start of certain surahs of the Quran, you have verses made up of just individual letters, right? Like Alif Lam Mim, Yasin, Taha, what else? Kaf, Ha, Ya, Ayn, Sad, that one, Hamim, Ayn, Sin, Qaf, all of those. These are huruf muqatta'at. So nobody knows the meaning of these verses, right? If you look in any tafsir, they'll usually follow it up by saying, Wallahu a'lamu bi muradihi. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is most aware of what they mean and what their purported intent is. And then the other type of incomprehensible verses are ambiguous descriptions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So for example, places where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about his hand, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about a hand attributed to him, or eyes, or various different descriptions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we know the literal meaning of these words independently. So we know what a hand is. We use the word hand to describe a human hand, right? But when you attribute these to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this results in a rational inconceivability. So rationally, we struggle to attribute, rationally we can't attribute the meaning, the common meaning of hand to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Likewise, we can't attribute the meaning of eyes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? These are rationally problematic. It's rationally problematic to attribute these meanings, and you'll learn more of that in your Aqidah module, which you're going to cover this term. I don't want to go into this because that's not the purpose of this course, but the fact is these are rationally inconceivable when applied to Allah, though we know the literal meanings applied to besides Allah. So we know what a hand is when it's in reference to a human. We know what eyes are when they're in reference to a human or animals or other creation. We just don't know what they mean when they're applied to Allah, because it's rationally inconceivable to apply this meaning to Allah, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not exist within a space or time, and you'll learn more of that in your Aqidah class. Allah created space and Allah created time, so you can't attribute something to him which can exist within a space or time which he created. It's a rational contradiction. So because you can't determine the exact nature of what this means, we say that this is incomprehensible. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best what the meaning is, and it's impossible for us to know what the meaning is, and so we consign the meaning to Allah, and we leave and we believe that the meaning, whatever it is the truth, and Allah knows it, and we don't delve in trying to figure out what that is. So those are the degrees of clarity and the degrees of obscurity. And I actually really like this categorization. I think it makes a lot of intuitive sense, and I hope it made intuitive sense for you guys as well. Now finally, just to summarize this lesson, some of the examples were a bit pretty heavy, and likewise the previous lesson when we looked at degrees of clarity as well, some of the examples were a bit heavy. So just to summarize, you've got 4 degrees of clarity, 4 degrees of obscurity. We discussed the degrees of clarity in yesterday's summary, so you can listen to the summary there. But the degrees of obscurity, we had 4. The first level was obscure. Something obscure, it's unclear. It's unclear, though the meaning itself is clear, its applicability to the situation we're trying to apply it to is unclear, because there's a deficiency or an excess in the meaning of the situation we're trying to apply it to, which makes it slightly unclear whether this text applies to this scenario or not. And we gave various examples. I gave the example of me telling you, go get me an ice cream. Let's go back. So I told you, go get me an ice cream, and you had the option of either getting me a fried ice cream or frozen yogurt, but you are unsure of whether ice cream applies to both of those. So fried ice cream has an additional meaning beyond ice cream, and frozen yogurt has a deficiency in meaning from ice cream. So the ruling would apply to fried ice cream, it would not apply to frozen yogurt. And then we looked at the example of the thief, and whether the ruling for a thief applies to a pickpocket or whether it applies to a grave robber. So we said a grave robber, so we said that a thief is somebody who steals something that was protected in a surreptitious or hidden or sneaky way. And this applies to a pickpocket. But the pickpocket has the additional meaning of doing it with haste, with speed, or doing it openly, right? Though still in a sneaky way, but he does it whilst the person is awake. So that is a pickpocket. So there is an additional meaning there. So we can apply the ruling of theft to a pickpocket. However, when we look at the grave robber isn't doing this surreptitiously. He's doing it out in the open. The occupant of the grave is there and he's the owner of it. However, the occupant of the grave is unable to protect what's his. So effectively the meaning of surreptitiousness doesn't apply in the grave robbing example. So therefore we can't apply the meaning, the ruling of theft to the grave robber. Then we looked at the second category. Second category was obscure, which is mushkil, right? Here the obscurity is slightly higher. The obscurity is slightly higher than the first level, which is unclear. There, the actual ruling was clear. Here, the actual ruling is obscure. Here, there's multiple possibilities for what the actual ruling could be. What's the ruling? So the ruling of the first one was, you have to just ponder a bit and try and figure out whether the ruling applies and whether there's an increase or a deficiency in application. Now here, you've got to do two steps. The ruling is that you first got to figure out all the possibilities. And then the second step is you figure out whether they apply or not. And we gave the example of idam, and we gave the example of me telling you, go and get me a bat. So you've got to figure out all the possible meanings of bat and which one applies. And then the example from the Quran that I gave was anna shi'tum fa'tu harthakum anna shi'tum, that approach your place of cultivation wherever or however you wish, whichever meaning of anna you want to take. So first you've got to figure out what are the meanings of anna, and we went through them. And then you've got to figure out which one of those you want to take, and we discussed that as well. And we said that however makes more sense in this case, and the reason was that there's no contradiction when you take that meaning versus when you take wherever. There is a contradiction because approaching your place of cultivation from the rear is impermissible. And we had an example of elusive language that I was using there as well, or kinaya, right? So just a bit of a throwback to that previous lesson that we did. Anyway, so that was the first two levels. We move on to the third level, which is equivocal. Equivocal is where there are so many meanings. Sorry, I'm on the wrong page in my notes. There are so many meanings that the text becomes obscure, and it's impossible to give preference to any one of those possible meanings unless you have clarification from the original source. So I gave the example. I said, get me that dessert that I like, and you don't know which dessert that is. So you can't get me any dessert unless you figure out which dessert that is by asking me and getting clarification from me which dessert it was that I meant. So the ruling is that you're not allowed to use this source as an evidence unless you obtain clarification. So the example from the Quran that we gave was وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَى, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prohibited riba. Riba just means increase. That could mean a variety of things, a wide number of things, and you can't exactly give any suggestion as to which one might be referred to unless you have clarification. And then we went through what that clarification was and where it's found. It's found in hadith, and once that's done, it becomes unequivocal. You've now got the clarification. It's now very, very clear. So the ruling is that, we already mentioned the ruling that you can't use it as evidence unless you obtain clarification. Finally, incomprehensible, right? Mutashabih. And we went through what the Quran says about mutashabih. The ruling is that a mutashabih is where it's impossible to ever know the meaning, right? The ruling is that you have to have belief that the meaning exists in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's knowledge, but you have to abstain from trying to figure it out. you leave it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that is mutashabih. The examples were the huruf al-muqatta'at like alif lam mim or ha mim. At the beginning of surahs you have these words which nobody knows what the meaning is, and we leave those meanings to Allah. And then you also have in the Quran ambiguous descriptions of Allah which are rationally contradictory, right, according to our understanding. And so therefore we say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best what they mean, and we are not going to dive into trying to figure out what they mean. Rather, we believe that it's true however Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala meant it, and yeah, we are not going to try and figure that out. So we believe in it and we leave the nature of those to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that is the summary of today's lesson. Inshallah, tomorrow we'll focus on inference and ways or degrees of inference. So I look forward to going over that, inshallah.